In the forgotten corner of Milltown, Sarah Morgan stands ankle-deep in discarded materials, her pregnant belly a stark contrast to the broken landscape. Abandoned by her partner and evicted from their apartment, she has nothing but determination and the clothes on her back. Day by day, piece by piece, she transforms trash into treasure, building walls from scrap wood, a roof from discarded metal sheets. Her hands bleed, but her spirit doesn't break. As her makeshift home takes shape, so does her resolve. But in a world that's been nothing but cruel, can one woman's desperate act of survival become something more? What happens when her story of raw determination catches the attention of someone who can change everything? Sarah's fingers trembled as she held the torn photograph, her thumb tracing the jagged edge where Mark's smiling face had been ripped away. 6 months ago, they'd posed together at the county fair, cotton candy in hand, futures intertwined. Now only her half remained, a reminder of promises broken. She tucked the photo back into her worn backpack, the morning sun filtering through the cracked window of the public restroom, where she'd spent 15 minutes washing up as best she could. The bathroom attendant had given her 5 more minutes before she'd have to leave. Sarah splashed cold water on her face, avoiding her reflection. 26 years old, 13 weeks pregnant, and completely alone. Mark, it's Sarah. Again, she spoke into her phone, the battery warning flashing. Please call me back. I don't know where to go. Her voice cracked on the last word. 3 weeks of unanswered calls since he'd walked out after seeing the pregnancy test. 3 weeks since the landlord had changed the locks when she couldn't make rent. The text message came as she exited the restroom. Stop calling. Not my problem. Each word a fresh wound. Sarah wandered downtown Milltown, once a thriving manufacturing hub, now littered with foreclosure signs and shuttered storefronts. Her hometown had been dying long before she'd hit rock bottom within it. Past the library where she'd spent the last few nights reading pregnancy books, until closing time. Past the shelter that had been full for the past week. Past the community center that had once offered hope, but now sat empty, another victim of budget cuts. Her social worker's words echoed. The perting list for housing assistance is 18 months. We can try for emergency placement, but with your situation, the unspoken truth hung between them. Single, unemployed, pregnant women were not priority cases in a system already stretched beyond capacity. Night fell as she reached the outskirts of town, where abandoned lots stretched between crumbling houses. Rain threatened in the distance. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter, the material straining against her slightly rounded belly. We'll figure something out, she whispered, one hand protectively covering where her child grew. I promise. She spotted the vacant lot then, partially hidden behind overgrown bushes. Unlike the others, this one contained the collapsed remains of what had once been a small garden shed. Weathered boards, broken furniture, discarded construction materials from nearby renovation projects. To most, it was a junkyard. To Sarah, it was possibility. That first night, she created a lean-to against the only standing wall of the shed, using a tarp she'd found discarded behind the hardware store. Rain pattered against the plastic as she curled beneath it, her backpack as a pillow. Despite everything, sleep came quickly, her body exhausted from walking and worry. Morning brought clarity and determination. Sarah had grown up watching her father, a construction worker, build and repair. She'd helped him renovate their kitchen when she was 12. Before college dreams and office job aspirations, she'd known the weight of a hammer, the satisfaction of a nail-driven true. At the library, she spent hours researching tiny houses, emergency shelters, and repurposed materials. She filled a notebook with sketches and lists, ignoring the curious glances from other patrons. The librarian, Miss Patel, noticed her interest. School project? She asked, helping Sarah locate more resources. Life project, Sarah replied, not meeting her eyes. Days blurred together. Sarah established a routine, mornings at the library researching, Afternoons collecting materials, evenings building until darkness fell. The lean-to became 4 precarious walls. The walls slowly strengthened. She salvaged nails from old boards, straightening them with rocks. Found half-empty cans of paint behind a renovated restaurant. Collected cardboard for insulation. Her former co-workers passed her on the street, eyes averted in uncomfortable recognition. Former friends sent unanswered texts. "Are you okay? Where are you staying?" She couldn't bear their pity, couldn't face admitting how far she had fallen. Her home, retired and traveling in their RV somewhere in Arizona, remained unaware. Their occasional calls were met with practiced assurances that everything was fine, just busy with work. The lie was easier than the truth, that their daughter slept surrounded by trash, building a home from society's discards, determined that her child would not be born homeless. That despite her education and ambitions, she had become invisible, another pregnant woman without resources in a world that looked away. But with each scavenged board, each wall that stood straighter than the day before, Sarah felt something long dormant reawaken. Purpose. Agents, the power to create shelter where none existed. The library card felt worn between Sarah's fingers, its laminated surface cracked at the corners from frequent use. In the month since she'd begun building her shelter, this small rectangle of plastic had become her most valuable possession. A passport to warmth, knowledge, and the clean room where she could wash her face and brush her teeth each morning. "You're here early again," Patel noted, scanning Sarah's card. The librarian's eyes held no judgment, only a quiet concern that Sarah pretended not to notice. "Research," Sarah replied with a small smile, clutching her notebook filled with construction diagrams. Today she needed to figure out how to create a more waterproof roof before the forecasted storms arrived. The Milltown Public Library had once been the jewel of downtown, its brick facade and broad steps speaking to more prosperous times. Now it stood as one of the few functioning public buildings in a neighborhood where boarded storefronts outnumbered her businesses. Inside, however, warmth and possibility remained, shelves of books offering escape, and for Sarah, practical salvation. At the computer terminal, Sarah logged into her email, still no response from the 3 job applications she'd sent last week. The pregnancy wasn't showing enough to matter in interviews yet, but soon she wouldn't be able to hide it. She closed the browser and instead pulled up construction videos, taking careful notes on insulation techniques using recycled materials. By early afternoon, Sarah gathered her things and headed toward the industrial area behind Main Street. Her library card tucked safely in her pocket, she pulled the small folding cart she'd found discarded behind the supermarket. Dumpster diving had become second nature now, her initial embarrassment replaced by practical necessity. Behind the hardware store she struck gold, several damaged sheets of corrugated plastic, discarded because of cracks, but still usable for her purposes. The cart protested under the weight as she carefully arranged them. "Hey, you can't take that." Sarah froze as a store employee emerged from the back door, his face set in annoyance. "It's trash," she said quietly, standing her ground despite her racing heart. "You threw it away." "Still our property," he countered, though uncertainty flashed across his features. Sarah straightened, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "I'm building a shelter. Please." These were being thrown out anyway. Something in her voice, not pleading, but determined, made the man pause. He looked at her more carefully, taking in her clean but worn clothes, the dark circles under her eyes, the careful way she'd packed the cart. "Fine," he finally said, turning back toward the door. "But don't come back, Marom. Boss won't like it." Sarah waited until he disappeared inside before resuming her salvage operation. One small victory. By late afternoon, she returned to her lot in the forgotten corner of Milltown, pulling her cart along overgrown sidewalk. The neighborhood had once been solidly middle class, the kind of place where factory workers bought their first homes and planted gardens. Now, half the houses stood empty, foreclosure notices weathering on their doors. Her own little corner stood behind a tangle of bushes that provided some privacy from the street. In the weeks since she'd claimed it, the space had transformed. What had begun as a precarious lean-to now resembled the skeleton of a tiny structure, approximately 8 feet square. Salvaged 2x4s created a basic frame. Mismatched pieces of plywood formed partial walls. A blue tarp, currently her roof, flapped in the breeze. Sarah unloaded her findings, carefully cataloguing each piece in her notebook. Organization was crucial when working with scavenged materials. She couldn't afford to waste anything. Tomorrow she would focus on the roof, using the corrugated plastic sheets to create a more permanent covering. As she worked, she felt eyes on her. Looking up, she noticed an elderly Asian woman watching from a second-floor window in one of the few occupied houses nearby. The woman made no movement to acknowledge Sarah's notice, simply continuing her observation with an unreadable expression. Not hostile, not friendly, merely curious. Sarah had seen her before, but they had never spoken. The surrounding lots told the story of Milltown's decline. Concrete foundations where houses had been demolished. Overgrown gardens gone wild. The skeleton of a child's swing set rusting in what had once been a family's backyard. Sarah had chosen this spot, not just for the remnants of the shed that gave her a starting point, but for its invisibility. Here, tucked away from judging eyes, she could build something from nothing. As dusk approached, Sarah secured her materials and prepared for another night in her half-built shelter. She added a found brick to the growing collection she used to weigh down the tarp. Each one represented another day of survival, another day closer to creating a real home for her child. The work gloves were a miraculous find, sturdy leather with only a small tear across one palm. Sarah had discovered them half buried in a pile of construction debris, seemingly abandoned by a worker at the renovation site 3 blocks over. She slipped them on now, the leather stiff but protective as she handled a splintered piece of plywood. 4 weeks into her building project, Sarah's hands had become a map of her efforts, calluses forming where smooth skin had once been, shallow cuts healing into pink lines, dirt embedded so deeply that no amount of scrubbing in the library bathroom could remove it entirely. The gloves were a blessing, even if they were slightly too large for her slender fingers. The trick is to create a moisture barrier, Sarah muttered to herself, recalling the construction video she'd watched that morning. Her pregnancy brain sometimes made details fuzzy, requiring her to repeat information aloud. Plastic sheeting between layers prevents condensation. Her shelter had evolved considerably from its humble beginnings. The frame now stood solidly, reinforced at the corners with metal brackets she'd salvaged from a discarded bed frame. 3 of the 4 walls were enclosed with a patchwork of plywood, particle board and weather-resistant paneling from what appeared to be an old garden shed. The roof, her proudest accomplishment, no longer consisted merely of a tarp, but rather corrugated plastic sheets arranged in an overlapping pattern that directed rainwater away from the structure. Inside was small, barely 64 square feet, but every inch had been considered. A raised platform in one corner kept her sleeping bag dry. A makeshift shelf held her few possessions, the backpack containing spare clothes, the torn photograph, her dwindling supply of prenatal vitamins, and several books borrowed from the library on construction and pregnancy. A plastic storage bin with a tight-fitting lid protected her food from pests. She'd even created a rudimentary window using a discarded picture frame with clear plastic instead of glass. Sarah worked methodically, her movements more careful now that her pregnancy had advanced to 16 weeks. Her belly had become a definite bump, impossible to disguise under her t-shirt, as she worked in the late September heat. The baby had started moving, tiny flutters that sometimes startled her in quiet moments. A reminder of why every nail, every scavenged board mattered. "You planning to deliver the baby in there too?" The voice startled Sarah. She turned to find a man in his 30s watching her from the edge of the lot, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. His clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt with rolled sleeves, marked him as neither homeless nor a construction worker. making his presence puzzling. "That's the plan," Sarah replied cautiously, unconsciously positioning herself between the stranger and the entrance to her shelter. "Can I help you with something?" The man raised his hands slightly, a gesture of peace. "Just passing by. Been watching you work for a few days now." He paused, seeming to consider his words. "You've got skills. The cross-bracing on your frame is textbook perfect." Sarah relaxed slightly, recognizing the language of someone with construction knowledge. "Library books, and YouTube when I can get Wi-Fi." He nodded, impressed. "Self-taught then? Not bad." He glanced around the lot. "You know this is private property, right? Owned by Milltown Development Corporation." Sarah's hands tightened on the work gloves. "It's been abandoned for years. Still owned. They're planning to clear these blocks eventually for new construction." He studied her shelter with a professional eye. No electrical, no plumbing, no permit, building code violations across the board. "Are you from the city?" Sarah asked, fear creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to remain calm. "I'm not bothering anyone here," the man shook his head. "Just someone who knows the rules." He hesitated, then added, "and someone who recognizes when rules might need bending." Before Sarah could respond, movement caught her eye. The elderly Asian woman from the nearby house had emerged onto her back porch. She stood watching them, a silent presence that somehow made Sarah feel slightly safer. The man noticed the woman too and nodded in her direction. "Mrs. Chen's been in that house for 40 years. Only one who refused to sell when the factory closed." He turned back to Sarah. "You've picked an interesting corner of Milltown." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond to this stranger who seemed to know the neighborhood and its history. "Your structure needs better insulation before winter," he finally said. "Professional assessment replacing personal curiosity. Michigan winters will cut right through those walls." He gestured toward the eastern side. "And that foundation needs to be raised higher off the ground to prevent moisture damage." With that, he turned to leave, pausing only to add, "I'd focus on those things if I were you, before someone less understanding notices what you're building here." Sarah ran her palm along the first wall she had completed, feeling the uneven texture beneath her fingers. Unlike the other walls that had been patched together from various materials, this one had been built entirely from repurposed wooden pallets she'd dismantled and reassembled. It wasn't perfect, gaps remained where the wood hadn't quite matched up, but it was solid, a testament to what determination could accomplish. 1 month had passed since she'd started building. October had arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the urgency of completing her shelter before winter. Her small structure now had 4 walls and a sloped roof that shed water reasonably well. The warning from the mysterious man had spurred her to focus on insulation, stuffing the wall cavities with plastic shopping bags, newspapers, and even dried leaves when nothing else was available. Each evening, Sarah would step back and evaluate her progress, mentally noting what needed to be addressed the next day. The structure still looked makeshift, a patchwork of materials in different colors and textures, but it was increasingly becoming a home. A small home built from society's cast-offs, but a home nonetheless. Mrs. Chen had begun acknowledging her with slight nods when Sarah passed by, a small gesture that somehow validated her presence in this forgotten corner. The mysterious man hadn't returned, but Sarah frequently found herself wondering about his warning regarding the property developers and building codes. Her baby bump was becoming more pronounced now, making movement more deliberate. The child within her seemed to approve of their shelter, often becoming more active as Sarah worked on improvements. "We're making progress," she would whisper, one hand on her stomach. "One piece at a time." The red umbrella appeared like a beacon against the darkening sky, its bright color a stark contrast to the gathering storm clouds. Sarah had been frantically securing loose materials around her shelter when she spotted Miss Aaron approaching across the overgrown lot, the umbrella clutched firmly in her weathered hand. "Storm coming," Mrs. Chen stated simply, her accented English clipped but clear. It was the first time the elderly woman had spoken to her in the 2 months since Sarah had begun building. Bad one. Sarah glanced anxiously at the sky. The weather report she'd checked at the library that morning had predicted thunderstorms, but the rapidly darkening clouds suggested something more severe. Her shelter, while improved, was still vulnerable to heavy wind and rain. "Thank you," Sarah replied, eyeing the umbrella uncertainly. Without further explanation, Mrs. Chen pressed the umbrella into Sarah's hands and turned to leave, her message delivered. She paused only briefly, looking back at the makeshift structure. "Need more support there." She pointed to the southwest corner where the wall met the roof. "Wind come from that direction." Before Sarah could respond, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, pattering against the plastic sheeting that formed her roof. Miss Chen nodded once more and hurried back toward her house, leaving Sarah holding the unexpected gift, the first act of direct kindness she'd experienced since beginning her building project. The sky opened minutes later, rain falling in sheets driven by gusting wind. Sarah retreated inside her shelter, opening the umbrella over the corner where water had begun to leak through. The wind howled around the small structure, finding every gap and weakness in her construction. A sudden, powerful gust tore loose one of the roof panels she'd recently installed, sending it clattering across the lot. "No, no, no." Sarah rushed outside, the red umbrella abandoned as she chased after the escaping panel. Rain soaked her immediately, plastering her hair to her face and neck. Her fingers closed around the edge of the panel just as lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. Struggling against the wind, Sarah dragged the panel back to her shelter. Water pooled inside where the missing section had left her roof open to the elements. Her sleeping bag was already soaked, along with the library books she'd been studying. Panic rose in her throat as she realized how quickly everything she'd built could be lost. Working frantically in the downpour, Sarah managed to reattach the panel, using additional screws she'd been saving for future improvements. Water continued to leak through multiple points in the roof, and the southeast wall had begun to bow inward under the pressure of the wind. She grabbed the red umbrella, using it to prop up the weakening wall while she searched for additional supports. Hours passed as Sarah fought to protect her shelter from the storm's fury. By midnight, the worst had passed, leaving behind a steady, gentle rain. Exhausted, Sarah sat in the center of her soaked home, surrounded by buckets and containers catching drips from the ceiling. The floor had become a shallow pool in places where water had found its way inside. Despite her efforts, the storm had exposed every weakness in her construction. The insulation she'd so carefully installed was sodden in places. One window had cracked from a piece of wind-blown debris. The southeast wall still bowed slightly inward despite her emergency repairs. As dawn approached, Sarah stepped outside to survey the damage in the gray morning light. The storm had left debris scattered across the lot, branches, trash, and someone's lost lawn chair. Her own structure still stood, but looked more fragile than ever against the elements. "Not good." Sarah turned to find Miss Chen standing at the edge of the lot once more, assessing the damage with critical eyes. The elderly woman approached slowly, examining the shelter with the expertise of someone who had weathered many storms. "Need better roof, better walls." Miss Chen pointed to specific weaknesses in the construction. "Winter coming soon, snow heavy." Sarah pushed wet hair from her face, fighting back tears of frustration. "I'm trying. I don't have proper materials." Miss Chen studied Sarah for a long moment, taking in her soaked clothes, her pregnant belly, the determination despite exhaustion etched on her face. Finally she nodded, seemingly coming to a decision. "My husband was builder. Many years." She gestured toward her house. "Come, dry clothes first. Then I show you something." Sarah hesitated, glancing back at her damaged shelter. "It stand for few hours more," Mrs. Chen said simply. "You need help. I have knowledge." She pointed to Sarah's stomach. "Baby need dry mother." The simple truth of those words broke through Sarah's stubborn independence. She nodded, picking up the red umbrella from where it had fallen, and followed the elderly woman across the rain-soaked lot toward the promise of dry clothes and building knowledge that could make the difference between shelter and true safety. The newspaper crinkled in Sarah's hands, the black and white image of a smiling man in an expensive suit staring back at her from beneath the headline. Milltown Revival Project set to begin in spring. Sarah had found the paper in the library's reading room, the front page story immediately catching her attention. Milltown Development Corporation announces ambitious plans to revitalize abandoned sectors, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. Phase 1 to focus on clearing blighted properties in the Eastern District. The Eastern District, where her shelter stood. Sarah scanned the article, panic rising as she absorbed the details. The corporation had secured final approvals from the city council. Demolition crews would begin clearing abandoned structures and preparing lots for new construction in March, just 4 months away, right around her due date. "This can't be happening," Sarah muttered, drawing a curious glance from an elderly man at a nearby table. She quickly folded the newspaper and shoved it into her backpack. Her mind raced as she left the library, barely noticing the cold November rain that had begun to fall. The past 2 weeks had been focused on rebuilding after the storm. With Mission's guidance, Sarah had significantly improved her shelter's structural integrity. The roof now had proper flashing around the edges to direct water away from the walls. The south-facing wall had been reinforced with salvaged 2x4s. Miss Chen's late husband had been a carpenter, and his knowledge, passed through his widow, was proving invaluable. But none of that would matter if bulldozers arrived in the spring. Sarah was so distracted by the newspaper's revelation that she didn't notice the city vehicle parked near her lot until she was nearly upon it. A white SUV with Milltown Building Department emblazoned on the door sat at the curb, and a man in a jacket and tie stood examining her shelter from the perimeter. Her first instinct was to retreat, to hide until he left, but the man had already spotted her. With a deep breath, Sarah approached her property, one hand protectively covering her now prominent baby bump. "Afternoon," the man said, his tone professionally neutral. He held up an ID badge. "Michael Barnes, City Building Inspector. Is this your structure?" Sarah nodded, fear making her voice small. "Yes. May I ask your name?" "Sarah Morgan." Michael Barnes consulted the tablet in his hand, making a note. "Ms. Morgan, are you aware that this structure has been erected without proper building permits on private property?" "It's abandoned property," Sarah replied, the defense feeling weak even to her own ears. "Nevertheless, it's owned by Milltown Development Corporation." Barnes gestured toward the shelter. "And regardless of land ownership, any residential structure requires proper permitting and must meet building code requirements." His eyes moved from the shelter to Sarah's pregnant belly and back. "You're living here?" "I don't have anywhere else," Sarah admitted, her voice stronger now. "What was the point in lying? I'm doing my best to make it safe and weatherproof." Barnes's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Ms. Morgan, I understand you're in a difficult situation, but I can't ignore code violations. This structure has no electricity, no plumbing, no proper foundation. It's not zoned for residential use." He hesitated. "There are resources available, women's shelters, transitional housing." "All full," Sarah interrupted, "or with waiting lists months long." "I've tried, Mr. Barnes. The shelters are overcrowded. Housing assistance has a 2-year wait list, and I can't afford rent anywhere on unemployment benefits." She gestured to the shelter. "So I built something." Barnes looked uncomfortable but determined. "I sympathize with your situation, but my job is to enforce the building code. This structure isn't safe, especially not for a mother and infant." He tapped something on his tablet. "I'll have to issue a notice of violation. You'll have 30 days to either bring it up to code or vacate." "Bring it up to code?" Sarah almost laughed. "How am I supposed to do that without money for permits, materials, or a contractor?" "That's not something I can—" "Please," Sarah cut him off, desperation in her voice. "Winter's coming. I have nowhere else to go. This is all I have." She gestured to her shelter, the product of months of scavenging and labor. I built this with my own hands to keep my baby safe. Barnes looked at the shelter again, this time with a more appraising eye. Despite its cobbled-together appearance, there was clear evidence of thoughtful construction. The roof's proper slope for water runoff, the raised foundation keeping the floor dry, the carefully sealed windows. "You built this yourself?" he asked, professional curiosity momentarily overriding his official duties. Sarah nodded. "Every piece, from discarded materials, books and YouTube videos." Pride crept into her voice despite the circumstances. "It's weathered 3 storms so far." Something shifted in Barnes' expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of her determination. He looked down at his tablet, then back at Sarah's shelter, clearly wrestling with an internal conflict between duty and compassion. The building code book landed on Sarah's makeshift table with a heavy thud, dust rising from its well-worn cover. Sarah looked up in surprise to find Michael Barnes standing in the doorway of her shelter, his expression a mixture of resignation and determination. "I shouldn't be doing this," he said by way of greeting. 3 days had passed since his official inspection. "But I also shouldn't pretend I don't see what's happening here." Sarah approached the book cautiously, as if it might disappear. "What is this?" "Michigan Building Code, Residential Section." Barnes stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the doorframe. His eyes moved professionally around the interior, noting details. "If you're determined to stay here, you should at least know what you're up against." Sarah opened the book, overwhelmed by the dense text and technical diagrams. There must be thousands of regulations in here. 1,842, to be exact. Barnes almost smiled. "But you only need to focus on basic structural safety for now." He flipped to a section marked with a yellow sticky note. "Foundation requirements. Your current setup isn't bad, but you need better anchoring against wind load." Sarah stared at him, confused by this unexpected turn. "I thought you were supposed to condemn this place." Barnes sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "Officially, yes. I filed the report." He gestured around the shelter. "But I also noted extenuating circumstances and recommended reassessment in 60 days rather than standard enforcement." He shrugged. "My supervisor wasn't happy, but she didn't override me." "Why would you do that?" Barnes was silent for a moment, considering the question. 15 years as a building inspector. I've condemned plenty of structures. Usually they're neglected by landlords trying to maximize profit or abandoned properties that attract drug activity." He looked directly at Sarah. "This is different. You're trying to create something safe from nothing. That's rare." He turned back to the book, pointing to another section. "Your roof pitch is actually good for water runoff, but your connection points need reinforcement. Snow load is the biggest concern now." Sarah felt the baby kick, a strong movement that made her place a hand on her rounded belly. The sensation drew Barnes' attention. "How far along?" he asked, his professional demeanor softening. 22 weeks, Sarah replied, surprised by the personal question. Barnes nodded, then reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in plastic. "I brought some things from my garage, leftover supplies from my own home renovation." He unwrapped the package to reveal an assortment of metal brackets, heavy-duty screws, and a small container of waterproof sealant, not enough to bring anything up to code, but might help with some of your connection points. Sarah's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me," Barnes replied quickly. "I'm still doing my job. If this place isn't significantly improved by the next inspection, I won't be able to delay enforcement again." He pointed to the book. "Study the sections I marked. Focus on structural integrity and weatherproofing first." Sarah nodded, already flipping through the pages. "I will." Barnes headed toward the door, then paused. "One more thing." He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table. "My personal number. If you have technical questions about the code requirements, He emphasized the last words, making it clear this wasn't an invitation for personal assistance beyond professional advice. After Barnes left, Sarah sat with the building code book open before her, the baby moving actively, as if aware of this new development. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the small nudges against her palm. "He came back," she whispered to her unborn child, "with help." The following days took on a new rhythm. Mornings at the library researching specific code requirements. Afternoons scavenging for materials that could meet the technical specifications. Evenings implementing improvements with Miss Chen occasionally providing guidance based on her late husband's expertise. Sarah had always been methodical, but now she approached her shelter with renewed purpose. The building code book became her constant companion, its margins filling with notes and calculations. She learned about load-bearing walls and proper insulation R values, about vapor barriers and ventilation requirements. Each page revealed how much she didn't know, but also provided a roadmap to legitimacy. When she encountered terms or concepts she didn't understand, Sarah would text Barnes with specific questions. His responses were always professional, factual and devoid of personal commentary, but he never failed to reply. 1 week after receiving the book, Sarah felt the first definitive movements of her baby. Not just flutters or nudges, but actual kicks. Strong, determined movements that sometimes took her breath away. She was creating life inside her body while simultaneously creating shelter with her hands. The parallel wasn't lost on her as she carefully installed the metal brackets Barnes had provided, securing her roof beams more firmly to the wall structure. "We're getting stronger," she told her baby, feeling an answering kick. "Both of us. Together." The cooking pot steamed gently on the small camp stove, the aroma of vegetable soup filling Sarah's shelter. Mrs. Chen hovered nearby, occasionally stirring the contents with a wooden spoon, worn smooth from decades of use. The pot itself, cast iron with a slightly dented lid, had appeared on Sarah's doorstep 3 days ago, left there by Mrs. Chen without explanation or ceremony. "Need protein," Mrs. Chen commented, dropping another handful of chopped tofu into the mixture. "Baby growing, mother too thin." Sarah smiled, continuing her work on the new storage shelves she was building along the north wall. In the month since Michael Barnes' unexpected assistance, a strange rhythm had developed between Sarah and the elderly woman. Miss Chen would appear most afternoons, sometimes with small offerings of food or practical items, always with critical observations about the shelter's construction and Sarah's health. "Your grandmother was right," Mrs. Chen continued, her English choppy but clear. "Cold enters body through feet. Need better floor insulation." Sarah paused in her work. "I never mentioned my grandmother." Mrs. Chen waved the comment away. "All grandmothers know same things. Different words, same wisdom." She tapped the wooden spoon against the pot's edge. "Almost ready. Put down tools, eat." Outside, December had arrived with bitter winds and occasional snow flurries. Inside, Sarah's shelter had transformed significantly. The walls now had proper insulation sandwiched between interior and exterior surfaces. The roof no longer leaked, even during heavy rain. A small solar-powered battery pack, salvaged from discarded garden lights, provided enough electricity for a single LED lamp during evening hours. Sarah washed her hands in a basin of water, then lowered herself carefully onto one of the 2 chairs Mrs. Chen had brought over from her house. Her pregnancy had advanced to 26 weeks, her belly now a prominent dome that made bending and building increasingly challenging. "You work too hard," Mrs. Chen observed, ladling soup into 2 mismatched bowls. "Baby tells you to rest. You should listen." "If I rest too much, we won't have a proper home before the baby comes," Sarah replied, accepting the bowl gratefully. The soup was simple but flavorful, nourishing in a way that her usual scavenged meals were not. Mrs. Chen made a dismissive sound. "Home is already proper. Better than many I see with fancy addresses." She settled into the other chair, her small frame barely filling it. "My Jung-ho would approve of your corners. All square, all strong, Sarah had learned that Jung-ho was Miss Chen's late husband, a carpenter who had built much of their home's interior with his own hands. His tools, the few that Mrs. Chen hadn't sold after his death, had occasionally made their way to Sarah's shelter for specific projects before being carefully returned. As they ate, a knock sounded at the door, 3 sharp raps that Sarah had come to recognize. "It's open, Michael," she called. The building inspector entered, stamping snow from his boots outside before stepping in. His visits had become semi-regular, officially to monitor progress, but increasingly taking on the character of supportive check-ins. He nodded to Mrs. Chen with the familiarity of someone who had encountered her several times before. "Mrs. Chen, making your famous soup, I see. Not famous, just food." The elderly woman tilted her head toward Sarah. "She needs more. Growing 2 bodies with 1 stomach." Michael smiled slightly, then turned to Sarah. "The shelving looks good. Are you using the lag bolts I mentioned for the wall anchoring?" "Got them from the restore yesterday," Sarah confirmed, "along with some donated insulation they had in the back. The volunteer there gave me extra when I explained what I was doing." This had been happening more frequently. Small kindnesses from unexpected sources. The hardware store clerk who forgot to charge her for a box of nails. The lumberyard worker who helped her load scrap wood into Mrs. Chen's garden cart. The library's maintenance man who'd given her leftover paint from their renovation. Michael nodded approvingly, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. "Came across these weather-stripping adhesives at a job site. Contractor was going to toss them because they ordered the wrong size." He placed the bag on the small table. "Should help with your door seal." Sarah accepted the offering with a nod of thanks. Both she and Michael maintained the fiction that these items were random finds rather than deliberate assistance, preserving his professional boundaries while acknowledging the reality of their evolving relationship. "Your next official inspection is in 2 weeks, Michael reminded her, his tone shifting to something more formal. "The Development Corporation's representatives will be accompanying me." Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "The owners? Why?" Michael's expression tightened slightly. "Standard procedure when there's a variance request under consideration." He glanced at Mrs. Chen, then back to Sarah. "They want to see what they're being asked to accommodate." The implication hung in the air. Michael had been advocating for her behind the scenes, trying to secure some form of exception that would allow her shelter to remain despite the coming development plans. "Will they approve it?" Sarah asked quietly. Michael's hesitation was answer enough. "Just focus on making this place as close to code as possible. Before then, safety is always the strongest argument." Mrs. Chen snorted softly. "Developers care about money, not safety." She fixed Michael with a knowing look. "You know this." "Maybe," Michael acknowledged. "But we still have to try the official channels first." As he turned to leave, Sarah noticed him slipping Mrs. Chen a small piece of paper. The elderly woman tucked it into her pocket without comment, but something in the exchange suggested a conversation and understanding, beyond what was being said aloud. When the door closed behind him, Sarah turned to Mrs. Chen. "What was that about?" Mrs. Chen simply resumed eating her soup. "Eat, grow strong. Coming storm needs strong walls and stronger people." The crib took shape beneath Sarah's hands, transformed from discarded furniture into something both beautiful and functional. She'd found the pieces behind an apartment building during a cleanup day. A broken nightstand, a dismantled coffee table, sturdy chair legs, materials others had deemed worthless, but that contained potential through her eyes. With careful measurements and precise cuts, Sarah crafted a small but sturdy crib that met safety standards she'd researched at the library. The side rails were spaced exactly according to consumer protection guidelines. The mattress support, made from a repurposed shelf reinforced with metal brackets, was tested repeatedly to ensure it would hold weight without sagging. She'd even created a simple mobile from colorful bottle caps and fishing line, suspended from a curved piece of driftwood. "Not bad for trash, huh?" Sarah murmured, running her hand over the sanded surface. She'd spent hours removing splinters and rough spots, then coating the wood with food-grade mineral oil that Mrs. Chen had provided. At 30 weeks pregnant, her movements were slower now, her belly making it difficult to maneuver in the small space. But her hands remained capable, transforming discarded objects into something new. A knock at her door interrupted her thought. It wasn't Michael's usual 3 sharp raps, nor Mrs. Chen's gentle tapping. This was louder, more insistent. Sarah opened the door to find a woman in a crisp pantsuit, standing there, clipboard in hand. Behind her, parked at the curb, was a city vehicle different from Michael's, newer, with the city seal prominently displayed on the door. "Sarah Morgan?" the woman asked briskly. "Yes, Linda Vasquez, senior building inspector." She held up an identification badge. "I'm here for a compliance check on this structure." Her gaze moved past Sarah, assessing the interior with critical eyes. "May I come in?" Sarah stepped back, allowing the woman entry while trying to mask her anxiety. Michael had mentioned nothing about another inspection before the scheduled one, with the Development Corporation representatives. Inspector Vasquez moved through the small space efficiently, making notes on her clipboard. Her expression revealed nothing as she examined the insulation, the electrical setup, the makeshift plumbing that allowed Sarah to collect rainwater for washing. "You built all this yourself?" she finally asked, her tone suggesting disbelief rather than admiration. "Yes," Sarah replied, "with some guidance from neighbors and books." Vasquez made another note, then pointed toward the crib. "And that? For the baby. It meets all safety standards for infant furniture." The inspector approached the crib, testing its stability with a firm push. It remained solid, not shifting even an inch. Something flickered across her face, perhaps reluctant acknowledgement of the quality workmanship. "Ms. Morgan, I've reviewed Inspector Barnes's reports on this structure," she said, turning back to Sarah. "While he's noted significant improvements, the fact remains that this building was constructed without permits on private property, lacks basic utilities required for residential occupation, and violates numerous zoning ordinances." Her voice was professionally detached. The standard procedure would be immediate condemnation and removal. Sarah felt her heart sink, one hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "Please," she began, but Vasquez raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not finished. Inspector Barnes has submitted a variance request on your behalf, citing extenuating circumstances and evidence of good faith efforts to improve safety." She glanced at her clipboard. "It's unusual." Before Sarah could respond, another knock came at the door, the familiar 3 raps that signaled Michael's arrival. When Sarah opened it, she found not only Michael but Mrs. Chen as well, both appearing slightly breathless, as if they'd hurried to reach her. "Big Inspector Vasquez." Michael acknowledged his superior with a nod. "I wasn't aware you were conducting an inspection today." Clearly, Vasquez replied dryly, "Random compliance checks are within my authority, Barnes, especially on cases with pending variance requests." Miss Chen stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding attention. "This girl build good house. Strong house. You see with your eyes, not just your papers." Vasquez raised an eyebrow at the elderly woman's intervention, but didn't dismiss her. "And you are?" "Lina Chen, neighbor 40 years. My husband builder before he die. I know good work when I see." Mrs. Chen gestured around the shelter. "This good work, not fancy but safe." Michael cleared his throat. "Mrs. Chen has been providing experienced oversight on the construction. Inspector. Her late husband was a licensed contractor." Sarah watched the exchange with growing confusion. The dynamic between these 3 suggested conversations and arrangements she hadn't been privy to. Michael seemed unsurprised by Miss Chen's advocacy, while Vasquez appeared to be weighing the elderly woman's assessment with unexpected seriousness. "The variance hearing is next week," Vasquez finally said, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "The Development Corporation will have representatives there, as will the City Planning Department." She looked directly at Sarah. "You should prepare to make your case, Ms. Morgan. The board rarely grants exceptions without compelling reason. I'll help her prepare, Michael offered, earning a sharp look from his superior. Remember where your paycheck comes from, Barnes, Vasquez warned, though without real heat behind the words. She turned back to Sarah. This structure has improved considerably from the initial report. I'll note that in my assessment. With that limited encouragement, she left, leaving Sarah staring at Michael and Mrs. Chen with dawning realization. You two have been working together, she said slowly. Behind the scenes, Michael had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Miss Chen may have convinced me that official channels move too slowly sometimes. Mrs. Chen simply nodded, satisfied. Sometimes building bridges more important than following maps. Now we prepare for hearing. Need to make smart people see what we already know. The solar panel gleamed in the winter sunlight, its dark surface absorbing energy even on this cold January day. Michael had installed it on the south-facing slope of Sarah's roof the previous weekend, connecting it to a small battery system that now powered an LED light strip, a phone charger, and most importantly, a small space heater that kept the interior temperature at a safe level during the coldest nights. It's not exactly up to electrical code, he had admitted while making the connections, but it's safe and it's better than candles or that propane heater you were using. The addition of reliable electricity had transformed Sarah's shelter in ways both practical and psychological. Light after sunset meant she could continue reading or working on projects. The space heater provided consistent warmth that protected her pipes from freezing, but perhaps most significantly, it represented a connection to the wider world, a recognition that her home, however unconventional, deserved the basic amenities that others took for granted. Now, at 32 weeks pregnant, Sarah sat by her window watching as a sleek black SUV pulled up outside her property. Two men in expensive overcoats emerged, their expressions suggesting they'd rather be anywhere else. One carried a leather portfolio, the other a tablet device. Behind them a city vehicle arrived, Michael's now familiar inspection car. "They're here," Sarah called to Mrs. Chen, who had arrived an hour earlier to help prepare for this crucial meeting. Miss Chen emerged from the small bathroom area where she'd been making last-minute adjustments to the plumbing. "Remember what we practice. Speak with confidence, not fear. Show what you build, not what still need building." Sarah nodded, smoothing her shirt over her prominent belly. She'd dressed carefully in her cleanest maternity clothes, hair neatly brushed and tied back. First impressions would matter today. Michael approached her door first, knocking his usual 3 times before opening it. "Sarah, these are representatives from Milltown Development Corporation. Miss Foster is their legal counsel, and Mr. Patel is the project manager for the Eastern District Revitalization." The men entered, their height making the shelter seem suddenly smaller. Their eyes moved critically around the space, taking in details with professional assessment rather than personal curiosity. "Miss Morgan," Mr. Foster acknowledged with a slight nod, "we understand you've been living here for approximately 5 months, without proper permits or authorization." "Yes," Sarah replied simply, following Michael's coaching not to apologize or qualify her actions. Mr. Patel stepped forward, consulting his tablet. "Our records indicate this lot is scheduled for clearing in March, along with adjacent properties. The area will become part of a mixed-use development with retail spaces and market-rate apartments." "I'm aware of the plans," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "I've reviewed the public documents available at the library." Miss Foster raised an eyebrow, perhaps surprised by her informed response. "Then you understand that regardless of the variance request pending with the building department, this remains private property slated for development. The corporation has clear title and development rights." "I understand property law," Sarah acknowledged, "but I also understand that municipalities have discretion regarding hardship cases and temporary occupancy permits." She gestured to her shelter. "Would you like to see what I've built while we discuss possibilities?" The small tour took only minutes, but Sarah presented each feature with the pride of an architect, showcasing a luxury home. She pointed out the reinforced roof designed to handle snow load, the insulated walls with proper vapor barrier, the rainwater collection system that provided non-potable water for washing and plants, the composting toilet system that met environmental health standards, the solar electrical system with battery back. All of these improvements have been documented and inspected, Michael added, his official role momentarily overtaking his personal involvement. The structure has been brought significantly closer to code compliance, particularly regarding safety issues. Mr. Patel seemed professionally curious despite himself, asking technical questions about the solar setup and water system. Mr. Foster remained unmoved, his focus clearly on legal rather than practical matters. Creative use of materials, Mr. Patel conceded. But ultimately, Morgan, this doesn't change the fact that the development plans have been approved and financed. Construction schedules are already in place. I understand that, Sarah replied. I'm not asking you to change your entire development. I'm asking for an accommodation, either allowing this structure to remain temporarily until I can find proper housing, or incorporating affordable units into your plan that people like me could actually access. Mr. Foster's expression hardened. Milltown Development doesn't do affordable housing. Our investors expect market rate returns, and this area has been specifically targeted for revitalization to attract higher income residents back to Milltown. Gentrification, you mean? Mrs. Chen interjected sharply. Push out poor people, bring in rich people. Old story. Economic revitalization, Mr. Foster corrected smoothly. Creating jobs, increasing the tax base, improving property values for existing homeowners like yourself. Mrs. Chen, I not sell to you 3 times already. Mrs. Chen reminded him, not everyone want what you selling. An uncomfortable silence fell. Sarah felt a familiar tightening across her abdomen, the Braxton Hicks contractions that had been increasing in frequency lately. She breathed through it, one hand supporting her belly, trying not to show discomfort during this crucial meeting. Michael noticed anyway. Perhaps we should conclude for today, he suggested. I believe you've seen enough to complete your assessment for the variance hearing. Mr. Foster closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. We have, and to be perfectly clear, Milltown Development will be opposing this variance request, while your construction efforts are admirable. Ms. Morgan, they don't override our legal rights to develop property we've purchased. As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt a sudden wave of dizziness. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself, the room momentarily spinning. Sarah, Michael's concerned voice seemed distant. Are you all right? She wanted to answer, to maintain the composed facade she'd worked so hard to present, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the startled expressions of the development representatives and Michael rushing toward her as she began to fall. The community petition lay on Sarah's small table, 6 pages of signatures gathered from surrounding neighborhoods. Save Sarah's Home was printed in bold letters across the top, followed by a concise explanation of her situation and the upcoming variance hearing. What had begun as Michael's quiet advocacy had somehow transformed into a neighborhood campaign. 87 signatures so far, Michael reported, settling into the chair beside her bed. Sarah had been discharged from the hospital that morning, after a 2-day stay for monitoring. The diagnosis, severe anemia combined with exhaustion and slight dehydration, had resulted in strict orders for rest and a regimen of iron supplements. I still can't believe you did this, Sarah said, fingering the petition pages with amazement. I didn't, not really. Michael glanced toward Mrs. Chen, who was busy preparing an iron-rich soup in the small cooking area. Mrs. Chen started it. I just helped with the wording and made copies. People want to help, Mrs. Chen stated matter-of-factly, stirring the pot. Not everyone agree with big company plans for neighborhood. Many remember when Milltown was for working people, not just rich investors. The hospital stay had been a turning point in multiple ways. Sarah's collapse in front of the development representatives had humanized her situation beyond abstract legal arguments. More significantly, the hospital social worker, had finally managed to secure her a spot on the priority housing list, though the apartment wouldn't be available for at least 2 months, well after her due date. Michael checked his watch. The reporter from the Milltown Gazette should be here soon. Are you sure you're up for this interview? Sarah nodded, adjusting her position against the pillows propped behind her back. The doctor said I need rest, not silence, and if sharing my story might help with the variance request, I need to try. The collapse had also revealed something Sarah hadn't anticipated: the extent to which Michael and Mrs. Chen had mobilized support during the weeks she'd been focused on improving her shelter. Neighbors she'd barely met had visited the hospital bringing home-cooked meals. The librarian, Miss Patel, had arrived with a stack of pregnancy and parenting books. Even Inspector Vasquez had stopped by briefly, her official demeanor softened by the hospital setting. A knock at the door signaled the reporter's arrival. Michael welcomed in a young woman with a messenger bag and a digital recorder. Eliza Wong, Milltown Gazette, she introduced herself, shaking Sarah's hand. Thank you for agreeing to share your story. She glanced around the shelter, taking in the neat organization and careful construction. I'd been following the variance request through public records, but seeing this in person is different. Do you mind if I record our conversation and take some photos? Sarah agreed, and the interview began. She explained her journey from homelessness to home building, careful to emphasize the safety measures she'd implemented and the support she'd received from neighbors. Miss Chan occasionally interjected with details Sarah overlooked, while Michael provided context about building codes and the variance process. The Development Corporation maintains they have legal rights to clear this property, Eliza noted, consulting her notes. How do you respond to that? They do have legal rights, Sarah acknowledged. I'm not disputing that. What I'm asking for is humanity and flexibility. This shelter is my only option until affordable housing becomes available. The variance would simply allow me to stay until after my baby is born, and I have a safe alternative. Eliza nodded, making notes. And what about the broader issue this raises? The lack of affordable housing in Milltown, while luxury development continues. Sarah hesitated, aware of the political implications. I can only speak to my own experience, but I think my situation reflects a larger problem. When someone with a college degree and work experience can't find housing they can afford, even when working full-time, something in the system is broken. After the reporter left, promising the article would appear in Sunday's edition, Sarah felt exhausted, but hopeful. Having her story in the local paper might generate more support before the variance hearing scheduled for the following week. You did well, Michael commented, helping her adjust her pillows. Stayed on message without sounding rehearsed. I meant everything I said, Sarah replied. I'm not looking for charity. I just need time and a fair chance. Mrs. Chen approached with a steaming bowl of soup. Eat now. Need strength for baby and for fight ahead. Tomorrow we go to community center meeting. Many people want to hear your words direct. Sarah accepted the bowl, surprised. You scheduled a community meeting? Not me, Mrs. Chen clarified. Neighborhood association. They vote next week on official position regarding development plan. Your situation now part of larger conversation. Michael nodded confirmation. It's grown beyond just your variance request, Sarah. People are questioning the entire development approach. Why there's no affordable housing component. Why existing residents weren't meaningfully consulted. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to reconcile her private struggle for shelter with this emerging community movement. She had built her tiny home seeking only personal survival, never imagining it would become a symbol in a larger battle over Milltown's future. Rest now, Miss Chen instructed, noticing Sarah's overwhelmed expression. Tomorrow enough time for big questions. As Sarah sipped the nourishing soup, she gazed around her small shelter, the solid walls she'd constructed board by board, the carefully sealed windows, the crib waiting for her child. Whatever happened at the variance hearing, or with the Development Corporation, she had already achieved something significant. She had turned discarded materials into a home strong enough to shelter not just herself, but a growing community of support. The social media post appeared on Sarah's phone screen, a video she hardly recognized as depicting her own life. Shot from a respectful distance, it showed her working on her shelter's exterior, pregnant belly prominent as she carefully sealed a window frame. The caption read, "Homeless pregnant woman builds house from trash, while developers plan luxury condos on same land. This is America in 2025. The view counter already showed over 2 million watches. When did someone film this? Sarah asked, looking up from her phone in confusion. The past week had been a whirlwind since the community meeting and newspaper article, but this was entirely unexpected. Michael leaned over to view the video. Looks recent. You're wearing the blue coat Mrs. Chen gave you. Maybe during the community meeting, there were a lot of people here that day. The video continued, showing Sarah's careful craftsmanship, the solar panel installation, and a brief interview with Mrs. Chen, who described how Sarah had built her home piece by piece while preparing for her baby's arrival. The contrast between Sarah's determined efforts and the development corporation's plans was explicitly highlighted, particularly their refusal to include affordable housing units. "This changes everything," Michael said quietly. "It's gone viral. Look at the shares and comments." Sarah scrolled through the comments section, overwhelmed by the thousands of responses. Most expressed outrage at the development corporation and admiration for her resilience. Others shared similar stories of housing insecurity despite full-time employment. Some offered assistance, everything from building materials to legal advice. "I never wanted to become some kind of symbol," Sarah murmured. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she didn't recognize. The fifth such call in the past hour. "Too late," Mrs. Chen observed pragmatically. "Sometimes story finds you, not you find story." She peered at the phone. "Who posting this video?" Sarah checked the account information. "Someone called Jamie Winters." "I don't know them." "I do," Michael said suddenly. "Jamie's a graduate student in urban planning at the State University. They were at the community meeting taking notes for a thesis on housing inequality. I didn't notice them filming." As if summoned by the mention of their name, a new message appeared from Jamie Winters. "I'm so sorry for not asking permission before posting. Your story needs to be heard. News outlets are contacting me. Can I pass your contact info to them? Or I can remove the video if you prefer." Sarah stared at the message, uncertain how to respond. Her instinct for privacy warred with the potential support this unexpected attention might generate for her variance request. Before she could decide, a knock at her door announced yet another unexpected visitor. Inspector Vasquez stood outside, her expression uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Miss Morgan, I assume you've seen the video?" Sarah nodded, inviting her inside. The inspector entered, nodding briefly to Michael and Mrs. Ch. "My office has received 17 calls this morning about your situation," Vasquez said without preamble. "The mayor's office has received more. The Development Corporation's Public Relations Department is apparently in crisis mode." She sighed, removing her glasses to pinch the bridge of her nose. "This has escalated beyond a simple variance request." "I didn't ask for this attention," Sarah said defensively. "I know," Vasquez acknowledged, "but it's happening regardless. The variance hearing has been moved to the main council chambers to accommodate public attendance, and several council members have already issued statements supporting your case." She replaced her glass. "The Development Corporation has requested an emergency meeting with city officials this afternoon." Michael straightened, suddenly alert. "They're worried about the public relations disaster." "Precisely." Vasquez's tone was professionally neutral, but a hint of satisfaction colored her words. "Nothing motivates corporate flexibility like the threat of bad publicity." Sarah's phone continued buzzing with notifications, social media tags, message requests, news alerts, mentioning her situation. The small shelter that had been her private refuge now felt like the epicenter of a public storm. "What should I do?" she asked, looking between Michael, Mrs. Chen, and surprisingly, Inspector Vasquez. "Decide what you want," Vasquez replied simply. "Not just for yourself, but what you're willing to represent, because whether you chose it or not, you've become the face of something larger. Mrs. Chen nodded in agreement. Many people build houses. Few build movements without trying. Sarah placed a protective hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her touch. At 34 weeks pregnant, her due date loomed increasingly close. Whatever decisions she made now would affect not just her immediate housing situation, but potentially her child's future and perhaps others facing similar circumstances. "I need to think," she said finally. "You don't have much time," Vasquez warned. "The Development Corporation will be working to control this narrative. They have resources and experience managing public relations crises." Michael's phone chimed with a text alert. He checked it, then looked up with surprise. "It's from Mr. Patel at the Development Corporation. He's requesting a private meeting with Sarah this afternoon, ahead of their session with city officials." "Damage control," Vasquez said knowingly. "Or opportunity," Mrs. Chen countered. "When tiger runs scared, sometimes rabbit can make demands." Sarah looked around her small shelter at the walls she'd built with discarded materials, the baby's crib waiting in the corner, the community petition on her table, and now the viral video spreading her story to millions of strangers. What had begun as a desperate act of survival had somehow transformed into something with potential power. "Tell Mr. Patel I'll meet with him," she decided, "but not alone, and not on their terms. They can come here, where everyone can see exactly what they're trying to take away." The DNA test results lay open on Sarah's table, the clinical language starkly contrasting with the emotional bombshell they contained. Probability of paternity 99.99998%, followed by two names: Mark Donovan, alleged father, and Richard Donovan, alleged paternal grandfather. Sarah stared at the document, still processing the impossible connection. "Mark's father owns Milltown Development Corporation," she whispered, finally looking up at Michael, who sat across from her with an expression of stunned disbelief. "The company trying to demolish my home is owned by my baby's grandfather." The revelation had come through an anonymous email that morning, corporate records linking Mark to Richard Donovan, followed by old family photos showing the resemblance between father and son, and finally a DNA database match that someone had obtained through questionable means. The sender identified themselves only as a concerned employee with access to company records. "This explains why Mark disappeared so completely," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "He wasn't just running from responsibility, he was protecting his father's development plans." Michael shook his head, still processing. If this gets out, a developer trying to bulldoze a shelter built by the mother of his grandchild, the PR nightmare would be catastrophic. "Perhaps that's why someone sent this," Sarah suggested, gesturing to the email. "Internal company politics, or someone with a conscience." The viral video of Sarah's shelter had already created significant problems for Milltown Development. Their hastily called meeting with city officials had resulted in a temporary stay on demolition plans, pending the variance hearing. Public sentiment had shifted dramatically against the corporation, with protesters appearing outside their downtown headquarters carrying signs featuring frames from the viral video. "We need legal advice," Michael began, but was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Sarah tensed. "I'm not expecting anyone. Mrs. Chen is at a doctor's appointment, and Inspector Vasquez said she wouldn't be back until tomorrow." Michael moved to the door cautiously, opening it to reveal a man in his early 30s wearing an expensive coat, his familiar features causing Sarah's heart to freeze in her chest. "Hello, Sarah," Mark said, his voice exactly as she remembered from 8 months ago. "Can I come in?" Sarah's instinct was to slam the door in his face, but curiosity and a simmering anger kept her silent as Michael reluctantly stepped aside. Mark entered, his eyes darting around the small shelter before settling uncomfortably on Sarah's pregnant belly. "You look well," he offered awkwardly. "What do you want, Mark?" Sarah demanded, one protective hand on her stomach. Mark sighed, removing his gloves with deliberate movements. "I saw the video. Everyone at my father's company is talking about it." He hesitated. I didn't know you were living here, in one of the development zones. How could you? Sarah replied coldly. That would require actually returning my calls. Michael shifted uncomfortably. I should give you privacy. Stay, Sarah commanded, not taking her eyes off Mark. I want a witness for whatever this is. Mark glanced at Michael with a flicker of annoyance before continuing. I'm here to help, Sarah. This situation has gotten out of hand, but there's a simple solution. He reached into his coat, producing an envelope. I can get you a proper apartment, paid through the end of the year, enough time to have the baby and get back on your feet. Sarah stared at the envelope, but made no move to take it. In exchange for what? Walking away from this place quietly, Mark gestured around the shelter. No variance hearing. No more viral videos or newspaper article. Just a clean break that works for everyone. You mean works for your father's company, Sarah corrected. And for you, keeping your connection to me hidden. Something shifted in Mark's expression. Surprise quickly masked by calculated composure. I don't know what you mean. Sarah slid the DNA results across the table. Richard Donovan is your father. The CEO of Milltown Development is my baby's grandfather. Interesting coincidence, don't you think? The color drained from Mark's face as he stared at the document. Where did you get this? Does it matter? It's true, isn't it? Mark sank into a chair without being invited, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Sarah once found endearing. Now it just seemed theatrical. This complicates things. I'd say it clarifies them, Michael interjected, his voice hard. You abandoned Sarah not just because of the pregnancy, but because your father's development plans would be jeopardized if anyone knew his son had impregnated a woman who would be displaced by his project. It wasn't like that, Mark protested, but his eyes betrayed him. Not entirely. Then what was it like? Sarah demanded. Mark's composure cracked. My father has certain expectations for the company, for me. When you told me about the pregnancy, I panicked. Then when I realized where you were building this place, he gestured around the shelter, it was too much of a coincidence. I thought maybe you'd found out about my family and were trying to leverage it somehow. Leverage? Sarah repeated incredulously. I built this place because I had nowhere else to go after you disappeared. I didn't even know your father owned a development company until last month. Before Mark could respond, another knock came at the door, sharper, more authoritative. Michael opened it to reveal an older man in an immaculate overcoat, his silver hair and patrician features forming an older version of Mark's face. Behind him stood Mr. Foster, the corporation's legal counsel. Mark, the older man said tersely. The car is waiting. Mark stood quickly. Father, I was just making an unauthorized settlement offer, apparently. Richard Donovan interrupted, his cold gaze moving from his son to Sarah. Ms. Morgan, I presume. Sarah straightened, meeting his eyes directly. Mr. Donovan, I suppose it was only a matter of time before you showed up yourself. Richard's expression remained impassive. I prefer to handle sensitive matters personally. He gestured to the DNA results still visible on the table, including family complications that threatened to derail multi-million-dollar investments. Father, Mark began again, but Richard silenced him with a sharp gesture. You've done enough damage. Wait in the car. When Mark hesitated, his father added, now, with a last conflicted glance at Sarah, Mark left. Richard took his place at the table, Mr. Foster standing attentively behind him. Let me be direct, Miss Morgan, Richard said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. My son's irresponsibility has created an unfortunate situation for all involved. I'm prepared to offer you a significantly more generous package than what he proposed, sufficient funds to purchase a modest home outright, rather than merely rent an apartment. Sarah noticed he hadn't specifically acknowledged the pregnancy or his relationship to her child. In exchange for my silence about our connection and abandoning my variance request, precisely, Richard confirmed without hesitation. A clean resolution that provides you with proper housing while allowing our development project to proceed as planned. your development project that will replace affordable housing with luxury condos most Milltown residents can't afford," Michael pointed out. Richard's gaze flicked to Michael with thinly veiled disdain. "The market determines what gets built, Mr. Barnes. Sentimentality doesn't finance construction, neither does exploiting housing insecurity," Michael countered. Richard turned his attention back to Sarah. "My offer is generous but time-limited. The variance hearing is in 3 days. If you accept, you could be in a proper home by the weekend. If not," he shrugged elegantly, "we proceed through official channels, where the outcome remains uncertain for everyone." Sarah studied the man who would be her child's grandfather. His expensive clothes, his calculated expressions, his assumption that everyone had a price. She thought about Mark's sudden reappearance after seeing the viral video, not because he cared about her welfare, but because she had become a liability to his family's business interests. "I need time to consider," she said finally. 24 hours, Richard replied, rising from the table. "Mr. Foster will provide contact details. I suggest you think carefully about what truly matters. Miss Morgan, making a political statement or securing a future for your child." After they left, Michael turned to Sarah. "You're not actually considering his offer, are you?" Sarah placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her touch. "I'm considering everything, including what happens after the variance hearing, win or lose, including what kind of world I want my child to grow up in." She looked around her small shelter built from discarded materials, but sturdy enough to withstand storms, cold and now corporate pressure. "This was never just about having a roof over my head, Michael. It became about proving I could create something lasting from nothing, about not being erased. And now it's about more than just me." Sarah replied, her voice strengthening. "It's about whether money and connections should determine who deserves a home and who doesn't, whether a corporation can buy silence when it's convenient." She looked down at the DNA test results, and whether my child's heritage should be a shameful secret or an acknowledged truth. The architectural plans unfurled across Sarah's table, professional blueprints detailing how her makeshift shelter could be transformed into a legitimate, tiny home. The design preserved her original structure while upgrading it to meet all building codes, proper electrical wiring, insulated walls with approved materials, a small bathroom with actual plumbing, and an innovative rainwater collection system that would supply most of her water needs. "These are remarkable," Sarah said, carefully tracing the detailed drawings with her finger. "How did you manage this?" Jamie Winters, the graduate student whose viral video had catapulted Sarah's situation into national awareness, beamed proudly. "My professor is on the board of Design for Dignity, a non-profit architecture firm that specializes in innovative housing solutions. When I showed them your story, they volunteered to create these pro bono." In the 3 days since Richard Donovan's ultimatum, Sarah's small shelter had become a hub of unexpected activity. News crews had set up across the street, held back only by a makeshift barrier erected by supportive neighbors. Social media channels were flooded with updates on the Milltown housing stand, as some outlets had dubbed it. A GoFundMe campaign started by strangers had already raised over $80,000 for Sarah's legal defense and baby supply. Most significantly, her decision to reject Richard Donovan's offer had transformed a personal housing dispute into a symbol of resistance against unchecked development and the affordable housing crisis affecting cities nationwide. The revelation of her connection to the Donovan family, which Sarah had strategically confirmed to a single trusted reporter, had added a David versus Goliath element that media outlets found irresistible. "The variance hearing is tomorrow," Michael reminded everyone, checking his watch, "and we still need to prepare Sarah's testimony." The small shelter was crowded with supporters. Mrs. Chen sat in her usual chair, supervising the proceedings with watchful eyes. Eliza Wong from the Milltown Gazette was taking notes for her ongoing coverage. A pro bono attorney from a housing rights organization reviewed documents at the counter. Even Inspector Vasquez had stopped by earlier to provide insight into the technical aspects of the variance process. "These plans give us a stronger position," the attorney Naomi Cruz observed. They demonstrate a clear path to full code compliance, addressing the building department's primary concerns. But they don't address the property ownership issue, Michael pointed out. Milltown Development still legally owns this land. One battle at a time, Mrs. Chen said firmly. First, stop bulldozers, then negotiate longer terms. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the community organizer, who had been coordinating supporters for the hearing. We have confirmation of at least 200 people planning to attend tomorrow, she reported, including representatives from 3 other neighborhoods facing similar development pressures. Sarah felt momentarily overwhelmed by the movement that had formed around her small shelter. What had begun as a desperate act of survival had evolved into something that affected the entire city's approach to development and housing. The personal stakes remained high. In just over a month, her baby would arrive, needing a stable home, but the broader implications had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined. The corporation's PR team has been working overtime, Eliza noted, scrolling through her phone. They've issued another statement emphasizing their commitment to community-minded development and hinting at a new proposal they'll present at tomorrow's hearing. Damage control, Naomi said dismissively. They know public opinion has turned against them, especially with the family connection revealed. Sarah hadn't heard from Mark or his father since rejecting their offer. Their silence spoke volumes about their strategy. They were regrouping, planning a more public-friendly approach rather than private intimidation. As the afternoon progressed into evening, final preparations for the hearing took shape. Sarah rehearsed her testimony with Naomi's guidance, focusing on the human story while acknowledging the legal complexities. Their architectural plans were copied and prepared for distribution to variance board members. Supporting documents detailing the improvements already made to the shelter were organized into presentation folders. By nightfall, most of the supporters had departed, leaving Sarah alone with Mrs. Chen, who insisted on staying overnight. Big day tomorrow, the elderly woman said, settling into the chair with a blanket. Need someone to watch while you sleep? Sarah lowered herself carefully onto her bed, her advanced pregnancy making movements increasingly difficult. At 36 weeks, the baby was active, often kicking strongly against her ribs, as if impatient to join the outside world. I never meant for all of this to happen, Sarah confessed quietly. I just needed a place to keep us safe. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. Sometimes small stone starts big landslide. Not stone's fault that mountain was ready to move. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the neighborhood in white. From her window, Sarah could see a few dedicated reporters still camped across the street, their news vans illuminated against the darkness. Tomorrow, the variance hearing would determine not just her immediate future, but potentially set precedent for how Milltown addressed development versus displacement. As she drifted towards sleep, Sarah felt the baby shift again, a strong movement as if offering encouragement. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had already accomplished something significant. They had refused to be erased, had transformed discarded materials into something worth fighting for. Like her shelter built piece by piece from society's cast-offs, a movement had been constructed from individual acts of support and resim. We'll be okay, she whispered to her unborn child. Whatever happens, we've already proven what we can build from nothing. The hospital bracelet encircled Sarah's wrist, its plastic surface printed with her name and patient information. She stared at it in the dim light of the maternity ward, the steady beeping of monitors filling the silence. 37 weeks pregnant, she had gone into labor during the variance hearing, a dramatic turn that had caused the proceedings to be abruptly adjourned. Your blood pressure spiked during your testimony, the doctor had explained hours later. Combined with the stress and the early contractions, we need to monitor you closely. The labor had progressed rapidly after that, her body seemingly determined to bring her child into the world, despite the unresolved status of their home. Miss Chan had stayed by her side throughout, her weathered hand gripping Sarah's with surprising strength during contractions. Michael had paced the waiting room, coordinating with supporters who had gathered outside the hospital after news of Sarah's condition spread. Now, in the quiet aftermath, Sarah gazed at the tiny bundle sleeping in the bassinet beside her bed. A daughter, £6, 4 ounces of perfect new life, oblivious to the housing battle that had defined her prenatal existence. Sarah had named her Hope, a decision that felt both obvious and profound. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Michael entered, his expression a mixture of joy and concern. "How are you feeling?" he asked, approaching the bassinet with wonder. "Tired, sore, amazed." Sarah smiled weakly. "What's happening outside?" "I've been avoiding the news." Michael's expression tightened. Richard Donovan moved quickly after the hearing was adjourned. "His crews are at your shelter right now." Sarah bolted upright, wincing at the pain the sudden movement caused. "They're demolishing it, but the variance request hasn't even been decided." "Not demolishing, not yet," Michael clarified. "But they're preparing the site, bringing in equipment. They're claiming the adjournment allows them to proceed with preliminary work since no stay was officially issued." Sarah felt her heart racing, the monitor beside her bed registering her distress with increasingly rapid beeps. "They're using my hospitalization as an opportunity." "Yes," Michael confirmed grimly. "But they didn't anticipate the response." He held up his phone, showing Sarah a live stream video. Her eyes widened at the scene unfolding on the small screen. Dozens of people, neighbors, supporters, even strangers moved by her story, had formed a human chain around her shelter, rorking the construction vehicles from approaching. Mrs. Chain stood at the front, her small frame somehow commanding as she faced down workers twice her size. "They've been there since word got out about Donovan's move," Michael explained. "The police have been called, but they're hesitant to intervene given all the media attention." Indeed, news crews were visible in the footage, cameras capturing the standoff as it unfolded. Protesters held signs reading "Homes over Profit" and "Protect Hope's House." The hashtag "Stand with Sarah" scrolled across the bottom of the screen, reportedly trending nationwide. "This has become much bigger than your variance request," Michael said softly. "It's turned into a referendum on development versus displacement." Sarah couldn't tear her eyes from the screen, from the sight of strangers, putting themselves at risk to protect the small structure she had built with her own hands. "I never asked for this. You didn't have to," Michael replied. "You built something that mattered, not just shelter, but a symbol of what's possible when we refuse to accept that there's no place for us." A nurse entered, frowning at Sarah's elevated vitals. "You need to rest," she admonished, giving Michael a pointed look. "Stress is not good for your recovery." Michael nodded apologetically. "Just one more minute." He turned back to Sarah. "Naomi is filing for an emergency injunction to halt any action until the variance hearing can be properly concluded. The judge should rule within hours." Sarah glanced at her sleeping daughter, then back to the images of people defending their home. "Tell them thank you. Tell them Hope and I are grateful." As Michael left, Sarah settled back against her pillows, one hand reaching into the bassinet to gently touch her daughter's tiny fingers. The contrast was stark. The peaceful newborn beside her, the confrontation unfolding across town. Two manifestations of the same fierce determination to create space in a world that often seemed to have no room for those without resources or connections. The hospital bracelet caught the light as Sarah moved, its institutional white stark against her skin. She had entered the hospital as an individual fighting for personal shelter, but somehow in the process of giving birth, she had also helped deliver something larger, a community awakening to its own power, to determine what kind of development deserved the term progress. Outside her window, the city continued its rhythms, unaware that in a forgotten corner of Milltown, the future of urban development was being contested over a tiny house built from society's discards. Her daughter slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, embodying the hope that had driven Sarah to build something lasting from nothing. "We're going to be okay," Sarah whispered to her sleeping child, a promise and a declaration of faith. "One way or another, we'll have a home to bring you to." The court injunction document lay before Judge Eleanor Martinez, its legal language temporarily halting Milltown Development Corporation's actions against Sarah's shelter. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with journalists filling the back rows and citizens lining the walls. 5 days had passed since Hope's birth, and Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her newborn daughter sleeping in a carrier beside her. This court finds sufficient cause to issue a temporary restraining order, preventing any demolition, construction, or site preparation activities at the property in question until the variance hearing can be properly concluded. Judge Martinez announced, her voice carrying authority throughout the hushed room. Furthermore, given the extraordinary public interest in this matter, I am ordering all parties to mediation before we proceed further. Richard Donovan sat stiffly at the defense table, his attorney whispering urgently in his ear. The Development Corporation's legal team had arrived with stacks of property records, zoning documents and precedent cases, a formidable display of corporate resources against a new mother and her pro bono representation. Yet the legal landscape had shifted dramatically in the days following Hope's birth. The human chain protecting Sarah's shelter had grown into a round-the-clock presence, with vigorous rotating shifts to ensure continuous coverage. National news programs had featured the standoff, framing it as a David versus Goliath struggle between community values and corporate development. Housing advocates from across the country had filed amicus briefs supporting Sarah's position. Most damaging to Milltown Development's case were the documents Naomi had uncovered through public records requests. Evidence that the corporation had repeatedly violated municipal requirements for community input in their previous projects, had been cited for environmental violations on 3 separate developments, and had failed to deliver on promises of green space and public amenities in exchange for tax incentives. Mediation will commence tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in Conference Room A. Judge Martinez continued. I expect good faith participation from all parties. She fixed Richard Donovan with a pointed look. This court takes a dim view of attempts to circumvent due process through opportunistic timing. As the proceedings concluded, Sarah was escorted through a side door to avoid the media crush outside. Michael and Mrs. Chen waited in a private conference room, both showing signs of fatigue from the ongoing shelter It's just a temporary victory, Naomi cautioned, as they gathered around the table. The injunction buys us time, but mediation will be challenging. The corporation still holds legal title to the land, but their reputation is in tatters, Michael pointed out. Their stock price has dropped 12% since this began. Investors are questioning Richard's leadership. Mrs. Chen nodded sagely. Money talks. Pride expensive when it costs millions. Sarah gently rocked Hope's carrier, the baby stirring slightly before settling back to sleep. What are our actual chances in mediation? What can we reasonably ask for? Naomi spread out several documents on the table. We have leverage we didn't have before. The public support, the media attention, the evidence of their past violation. We could potentially negotiate for more than just your individual situation. What do you mean? Sarah asked. A community benefits agreement, Naomi explained. Legally binding commitments from Milltown Development to include affordable housing units in this and future developments, to hire locally for construction, to create genuine green spaces. Michael leaned forward eagerly. We could address the systemic issues, not just save one shelter. Sarah looked down at her sleeping daughter, contemplating the unexpected opportunity. What had begun as her desperate fight for personal shelter had evolved into a potential turning point for how development happened in Milltown, and perhaps beyond. There's something else to consider, Naomi added hesitantly. Your connection to the Donovan family. Hope is legally entitled to certain considerations as Richard's grandchild. Sarah tensed. I don't want anything from them personally, not even acknowledgement. Michael asked gently, for Hope's sake? Before Sarah could respond, the conference room door opened to reveal Mark Donovan, looking uncomfortable in the doorway. May I come in? The room fell silent as Sarah considered her response. This man who had abandoned her, whose father had tried to bulldoze her home, now stood seeking entry into this fragile moment of victory. "Why are you here, Mark?" Sarah finally asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotion. "To offer a different path forward," he replied, stepping cautiously into the room. "One my father doesn't know about yet." Naomi shifted protectively closer to Sarah. "Any proposals should go through council." Mark nodded in acknowledgement. "I understand, but this is both business and personal." His gaze fell on the baby carrier, his expression softening visibly. "Is that your daughter?" Sarah confirmed. Hope. Something shifted in Mark's demeanor. A crack in the polished exterior he'd maintained through this conflict. He reached slowly into his suit jacket and withdrew a USB drive. "Internal files from Milltown Development," he explained, placing it on the table. "Financial projections, board minutes, communications about this project and other things that could strengthen your position in mediation considerably." Michael stared at the drive, then at Mark with suspicion. "Why would you betray your father's company?" Mark's gaze remained on Hope. "Because some things matter more than business." He finally looked up at Sarah. "Tomorrow in mediation, my father will present a new proposal. Before you respond, you should see what's on this drive." As he turned to leave, Sarah called after him. "Mark, why now? After all this time?" He paused at the door, his back to the room. "Because I saw what you built. Not just that shelter, but a community around it. You created something meaningful from nothing." He glanced back, a mix of regret and resolution in his expression. "Meanwhile, I've spent years destroying things of value to create profit. It's time I built something worthwhile too." The door closed behind him, leaving the room in contemplative silence. The USB drive sat on the table, a small object potentially containing the leverage that could transform this individual housing battle into meaningful systemic change. Mrs. Chin was the first to speak, her weathered hand reaching for the drive. "Sometimes good house needs bad materials to make strong foundation. We use what we have, not what we wish for." Sarah nodded slowly, looking between her daughter and the unexpected tool Mark had provided. Tomorrow's mediation would determine not just where Hope would come home to, but potentially how development would proceed throughout Milltown, whether profit alone would continue to determine who deserved housing, or whether community needs would finally have equal weight in the equation. The house deed rested in Sarah's hands, official and unmistakable with its embossed seal and legal language transferring ownership of the land beneath her shelter. 6 months had passed since the mediation that had transformed both her personal circumstances and Milltown's approach to development. "Still can't believe it's really mine," Sarah murmured, carefully placing the document back in its protective folder. Beside her, Hope babbled happily in her handmade high chair, now 6 months old and thriving. The shelter had evolved considerably since those tense days of standoffs and court hearings. What had begun as a desperate collection of salvaged materials now stood as a proper tiny home, its construction legitimized through a pioneering permit process that had since been adopted as a pathway for other alternative housing projects throughout the city. Michael knocked at the door before entering, a habit he'd maintained despite their relationships. Evolution from official inspector to friend to something not yet defined but increasingly significant. "Community board meeting starts in an hour," he reminded her. "Do you want me to take Hope to Mrs. Chen's first?" Sarah shook her head. "She should be there. It's her future too." The mediation had produced an unexpected resolution. Using the internal documents Mark had provided, Naomi had leveraged Milltown Development into a comprehensive community benefits agreement. The corporation would proceed with a modified version of their original plan, but with 20% of units dedicated to affordable housing, local hiring requirements, and green space preservation. Most significantly for Sarah, the agreement had carved out an exception for her tiny home, transferring ownership of its small footprint while incorporating it into the design of the new development as a historical structure and model for sustainable living. The settlement had included funds for proper upgrades to bring it fully up to code, turning what had once been a desperate shelter into a permanent home. Richard Donovan had resigned as CEO shortly afterward, the public relations disaster and shareholder revolt finally forcing his departure. Mark had surprised everyone by declining to succeed his father, instead launching a separate venture focused on affordable housing innovations. His relationship with Hope remained cautious and developing, monthly visits and a college fund, with boundaries that acknowledged the complex history between her parents. "Ready?" Michael asked as Sarah gathered Hope into her arms. They stepped outside into the spring sunshine, the neighborhood around them a mixture of construction and conservation. The development was proceeding, but with significant modifications that reflected community input rather than solely corporate priority. Sarah's tiny house now served as the unofficial headquarters for the Milltown Housing Trust, a non-profit she had founded using a portion of the settlement fund. The organization provided support for others facing housing insecurity, advocated for policy changes, and offered workshops on sustainable building techniques. Mrs. Chen waited for them at the corner, her ever-present red umbrella serving as a sunshade in the warm weather. "Big meeting today," she observed as they approached. "Many decisions to make." Together, they walked toward the community center, passing construction sites where workers waved in familiar greeting. Several were residents who had secured jobs through the local hiring provisions of the agreement. Others were students learning green building techniques through a partnership with the state university. Jamie Winter's graduate project had expanded into a full certificate program. As they neared the community center, Sarah noticed a young pregnant woman studying the bulletin board where housing trust flyers were posted. Something in her posture, the mixture of desperation and determination, sent a wave of recognition through Sarah. She shifted Hope to her other hip and approached the woman. "Are you looking for housing resources?" she asked gently. The woman turned, surprise and weariness in her expression. "Just exploring options. My situation is complicated." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Mine was too, once." She gestured toward the tiny house visible in the distance, now landscaped with a small garden where salvaged plants flourished. "That's where I started, building something from nothing when I had nowhere else to go." Hope reached toward the woman's rounded belly with curious fingers, bringing a reluctant smile to the stranger's face. "I heard about that story. I didn't realize it was you." "Come to the meeting," Sarah invited. "We're discussing the next phase of affordable units and the apprenticeship program for construction training. There's more than one way to build a home." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "I'm Tanya." "Sarah, this is Hope." Sarah shifted her daughter, who babbled happily at the introduction. "And this is Mrs. Chen, who taught me that sometimes good houses need unexpected foundations." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "And Michael, who knows rules sometimes need bending to make better ones." As they entered the community center together, Sarah felt the familiar sense of wonder at how far they had come. Her desperate act of survival had sparked changes that now offered paths forward for others facing similar circumstances. The tiny house built from society's discards had become not just a home, but the cornerstone of something much larger. Proof that value could be created from what others had deemed worthless, that determination could transform not just materials, but systems. In the meeting room, neighbors and officials gathered around tables covered with plans and proposals. Sarah took her place at the front, Hope content on her lap, the journey from homeless pregnant woman to community leader still sometimes surreal. "Let's begin," she said, as Hope reached curiously for the garden plans before them. Mother and daughter, both growing in a home built by hand, surrounded by a community that had learned that sometimes the most important structures were the ones that refused to be erased.